The integrated model represents a new way of looking at science education for a lot of us, so it's a reasonable question to ask, where did this whole integrated thing come from? Now, there are a lot of paths, including this picture here from a major industry path. But another place to look is at today's most competitive higher education programs that are in fact moving towards a strongly integrated program. So I looked through the catalog of Stanford University, and biology majors can choose one of several concentrations shown here. And there's some classics like neurobiology and marine biology, studying microbes and immunity, things that are really life science rich topics. But all of the other concentrations are interdisciplinary and integrated. So the ecology and evolution category, very strong earth science ties. There's biochemistry, biophysics, and even computational biology. My major, geology, has made quite a few shifts since I was an undergraduate. Now, geology majors must take at least one course from each of the following categories. There's classic geology category of surface and hydrologic processes, but then look at these other required categories, the four others here. Biogeosciences, earth materials and geochemistry, tectonics and geophysics, and geospatial statistics and computer science. These are all considered required parts of what it means to be a geology major today at Stanford. Now, I admit that not every university is moved towards this level of innovation, but the top institutions are starting to look this way, and it's only a matter of time before the rest of the world follows along. We can discover another motivation for going towards an integrated model by looking at a different data set. This is living Nobel Prize winners by country. And you can see that the US has been producing many of the greatest thinkers that are alive today, hands down. In fact, in 2016, 6 Americans won Nobel Prizes. However, none of those awardees was born and educated in the US. In fact, 40% of chemistry, physics, and medicine Nobel Prizes awarded to US scientists since 2000 have been awarded to foreign-born scientists, people that were not educated in our system. This point is reiterated when we look at other measures of innovation. For example, when we look at the patents that are filed in the US, more than half of those are actually issued to foreign companies. Of the patents that are actually filed by US universities, say, more than 3/4 of those are submitted by people educated outside the US. Among the students that are studying in our own universities, foreign students account for 57% of all PhDs in engineering and 43% of master's degrees in engineering. These are the future leaders in innovation of science and technology for us, and they are coming from other countries. Many of them are returning back to those countries. In terms of job creation within our country, in terms of Silicon Valley startups, more than half of those have been launched by people educated outside the US. Within big companies like Facebook, more than 15% of their workforce is actually imported as foreign workers who are coming to this country specifically because they are highly skilled and get special visas to do that. Now, this isn't to say anything bad about immigration. In fact, you can see how much immigration has helped fuel the innovation that's happening here in our own country. But it does help beg the question, what are all these countries doing that makes them so successful? And how can our educational system help produce many of the same results? In order to answer that question, Achieve, which is the organization that wrote the Next Generation Science Standards originally, they went and did a study of 10 top performing leaders in science. These are countries and provinces that scored really well on standardized tests in science, but also are the sources of innovation, patents, and all of those other things. And what they found is all 10 teach integrated science through middle school. In fact, 7 of the 10 remained integrated all the way through 10th grade. In a summary of all of this, Achieve wrote, standards based around unifying ideas for primary through lower secondary, that's middle school, seem to confer more benefits than a discipline-based structure. And it is this conclusion that helped the Achieve group design the Next Generation Science Standards and our 3 dimensions. I always like to show our NGSS logo here and do a quick quiz. So we've got these 3 different colors here, and each one of them represents one of the dimensions of science. So quick quiz, the orange represents disciplinary core ideas. What scientists and engineers know? The green represents the cross-cutting concepts. That's right. That's how scientists and engineers think. And the blue represents the science and engineering practices. That's what scientists and engineers do. In the center of the logo, I have a trick question for you. What goes there? Well, the official logo itself doesn't have anything, but I always like to put phenomena in the center. And that's because phenomena drive our instruction, and we use these 3 dimensions to try to understand phenomena. It's only by putting all 3 of these together that we can get an accurate lens on things that are happening in the world that we're observing and be able to explain and understand them. I like to illustrate how phenomena can help guide our instruction with an example, and this example also sheds a little bit of light on the cross-cutting concepts, which are probably the most abstract and the hardest for us to get our heads around. I described them a moment ago as how scientists and engineers think, and they're also described as underlying themes that have value in all disciplines of science. But what does that actually mean in practice? Well, I'm a geologist by training, and I happen to be married to a physicist. And I'd often go out when I was in graduate school with her friends, her physicist friends, and we would sit around and they would talk about their research. And quite honestly, I was lost some of the time. I couldn't understand what they were talking about. Now, over the years, I think I've become a better scientist, and I've been able to understand things a little bit more about what they're saying. But something that's really helped me has been studying the NGSS Crosscutting Concepts. What they've allowed me to do is they've really made it explicit to me what it is that makes up science and the way of thinking about science, so that when I'm listening to things, I have basically a template for meaningful questions that I can ask. I can hear people talking about energy, and I can think, energy. Well, energy, we should be tracking the flow of energy, and we can look at how energy is moving through the system that they're talking about, and I can ask questions about that. Or they might be talking about some specific structure. And I can say, structures always have a specific function, and I can start asking questions related to that. And really, the cross-cutting concepts have allowed me to become a better scientist, such that I can talk to a physicist or a biologist, and I can understand their research better and ask more meaningful questions. Let me show you an example. I'm going to show you this phenomenon, something that I observed myself. This is my ski pole here from out in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and I came across something that I've never seen before. Have you ever seen one of these things? Whenever you come across something in science that's a little bit crazy and extreme, you always kind of think to yourself, wow, is this a unique event, or is some sort of common pattern that has a cause that I can look to and figure out? Here's another picture that tells me, okay, there is indeed a pattern here. This is something that recurs, and so I should start looking for things that might help me understand what could cause it. So there's cross-cutting concept number 2. And whenever you see anything in science, you can always invoke that question. But we can go further than that. I'm starting to get this picture in my head that maybe these things are rolling down the hill, and that has something to do with how they get formed. So then I say, I'm going to invoke cross-cutting concept 6, structure and function, and ask, is the shape of that swirl consistent with this mechanism in my head of rolling down the hill? And I think it is. I think that could be evidence in favor of things. But this sort of general description of things is not really, that's not really enough in science. We'd like to be a little bit more specific. So let's take a look and say, are the outer layers bigger than the inner layers? So I'm seeing something about the structure in more detail. And I'm asking, what's causing that? Scientists also like to measure things because it really helps us nail things down. I need to figure something out where I can measure something that could provide me evidence that this is actually the mechanism that's causing these things. So I might ask, those layers that I see in the snow rollers, are those layers, is the thickness of those layers, is that similar to the depth of the grooves that are uphill of the swirl? because I think it's accumulating snow. Another question that I could ask about measuring it is that I could unroll that snow roller in my head and sort of measure out how long those spirals are, and then follow that track behind it and see how long is that track. Do those two match up? If so, I might have a good idea of what the mechanism is here. So now I'm starting to think like a scientist. But there's a little bit more. I really wish I could go back and take this picture again, because this doesn't capture the full field of view that I wanted to capture. What you see here is this section where there are a bunch of snow rollers on the ground, right in one place. But a little bit to the left, you can see just beautiful, smooth powder with nothing. And there's another section of snow rollers a little bit on the right side of this picture, but if you went a few feet beyond that, again, no snow rollers, just beautiful, unbroken snow. In fact, I've been out for many years going up and visiting the snow, and I've known many other people that have gone up to the snow, and out of all those times, years and years worth of experience, the only place that I've ever seen these, and the only time, is this 20-foot section on this one trip. So when we start seeing these really unique behaviors, we start thinking, some unique set of conditions needed to make this work. That means that there's a system that has this really unique property that it's creating these snow rollers in this specific case. And so I want to know what unique ingredients and conditions conspire to allow this to form. Well, I'm going to invoke Crosscutting Concept 4 here, thinking about this as a system. And so I have to start asking the question, well, what are the components of this system? There's obviously snow. I see this is on a hillside, so I should be thinking about that. And you can't see this very well, but in the top of the picture up there, you see the well of a tree, and there's some trees in there. So I'm thinking, okay, these are the components, and what about those components can I ask? I need to drill down a little bit more. I can ask the question, well, snow has usually a moisture content, and maybe that's affected by the air temperature. The snow has a depth. The slope, the hill slope there, has a certain angle. Maybe that's important. And those trees that are up there, are they important? I kind of had this picture in my head that the snow fell down off of the tree branches and then rolled down the hill. Well, if that's the case, does the height of the branches matter? And so now you can see how I'm using these cross-cutting concepts, and I'm starting to really think very deeply and very richly about this phenomenon that I've never seen before and I know nothing about. But I'm still able to come up with really interesting investigatable questions because I'm using these cross-cutting concepts to help me think of those questions. Now, if you'd like to have a template of questions related to the cross-cutting concepts, you can go to the California Framework to Chapter 1, and for each one of the cross-cutting concepts, we have a list of really good questions that you might want to ask related to those cross-cutting concepts. So I really recommend that you go and take a look at that part of our overview chapter. So we've seen this great phenomenon, and now I have this question. Which of the 4 disciplines of NGSS were we addressing in that snow spiral example? Now, a lot of teachers, when I talk to them, they often will say, oh, we were doing all of them. I would say that we talked about trees. We didn't really talk about anything about them as a living thing. We could have just as easily had a rooftop with snow sliding off of an angled roof. That was not part of our system, was nothing about the life. So I would say that we did not do life science. But we did look at a landscape and try and figure out how it worked in terms of some things about weather. So that's definitely the earth science discipline. We talked about hill slopes and rolling, and gravity is probably in there. That's a physical science concept. And engineering's about designing solutions to problems. We didn't end up really talking about designing a solution to anything. We talked about understanding things, but we didn't get into the realm of engineering, at least in my thinking. So I would say that we did earth science and physical science in this example. Notice how our focus was on the phenomenon. It was not on the DCI. I didn't start off and say, today everyone, we're going to learn about how snow's moisture content is affected by the air temperature. I didn't start there with an earth science disciplinary core idea that I wanted to get across, or a physical science one. I started with something interesting that was happening in the world and used that to get at the core ideas that I needed to. And that is the basis for doing integrated science. This phenomenon-driven approach is going to help us accomplish really the overarching goal of the California Next Generation Science Standards, which is to prepare future citizens and future scientists. Two different outcomes and two different goals that work together. This part that we show here on this slide is actually probably my favorite part of the NGSS in California, which is that California has really said that a lot of the phenomena that we should be looking at are related to local environmental problems. And in fact, California has something called the Environmental Principles and Concept. It turns out that back since 2004, these have been part of the state law, that these are something that we should be teaching in all of our California classrooms. But we just didn't really know about them for the most part. So as California is rolling out its new next generation science standards, we're using this opportunity to really bring those to the forefront and use those to help us motivate phenomena-based instruction. So we always like to start with these local problems that are relevant to students' lives. Then, we don't want to just leave them hanging with all these problems over their head. This is where the engineering comes in, and we focus on designing solutions to those problems. And this closed-loop cycle here is a wonderful way to study things, and problems and solutions often cross disciplinary boundaries. So this is yet another reason that we might want to think about going integrated. Now that we're motivated to implement some sort of integrated model to take advantage of all of these synergies between different disciplines, we need to figure out how to do it. Now, the California framework illustrates two possible approaches to integration. One is unifying around the lens of cross-cutting concepts, and the other is unifying around phenomena. And you'll see the examples of both of these within the framework. Both of them are driven by specifically studying phenomena, but how the integration happens is a little bit different between the two. So let's take a look at them in turn so we can see how they differ. When we're talking about unifying around cross-cutting concepts, what we do is we start by investigating a phenomenon from, say, discipline one, like, say, looking at the body system and thinking about what it means to be a system, and thinking about how the body has a boundary, it has components, it has inputs and outputs like the food that we eat and the air that we breathe in and out. And we really explicitly discuss the cross-cutting concept, so we have a rich understanding of what that cross-cutting concept means in this discipline. Then we move on to investigate some phenomenon from another discipline, say the earth sciences, and we look at the earth as a system, and we talk about how it has a boundary and how it has inputs and outputs and different components that interact with one another. And once we've done that, we cap this off. We really accomplish the integration by explicitly relating the phenomenon in terms of the cross-cutting concept. We look at how they're similar and how they're different, talk about how the inputs differ, how the boundaries differ. Like the skin is a pretty firm, rigid boundary. You have an end point to your body and the air begins, whereas within the Earth system, that boundary is a little bit fuzzier as the atmosphere sort of dies out, and where you say the ending is a little bit more obscure. So as we start talking about those similarities and differences, this gives us insight into both of these disciplines. Another approach is to unify around phenomena. And that was what we did with our snow spirals. We started with some sort of a question or a problem. We looked at something interesting, and we said, all right, that's our anchoring phenomenon. We're going to use that, and we're going to try and understand that through the course of instruction. Then we're going to pull in understanding from one discipline and another discipline, whatever we need to understand that problem. We'll probably go ahead and investigate related phenomena from discipline 1 and then related phenomena from discipline 2 so that we can really understand each of those pieces a little bit more fully before we finally get to the end of the cycle and we explain the phenomenon or solve the problem. And we really tie things together as a package by bringing that understanding from each of these disciplines together at the end. Now, as I mentioned, these are both really valid approaches to integration. When you're thinking about unifying around cross-cutting concepts, you're inherently a little bit more abstract. And for the middle school, I sometimes, on a personal level, even though it shows up in our framework a fair amount, I personally have a slight preference for unifying around the phenomena. But like I said, you'll see both of those in our framework, and so be on the lookout for them. So what does a really good integrated phenomenon look like in the CA NGSS? Well, here's an example of the Northridge earthquake in 1994. A lot of you probably were around in Southern California, may have even felt that. But you may not have known that it triggered 11,000 landslides simultaneously. And so in this picture on the left here, this white clouds here, that's actually dust thrown up by the landslides in the few minutes following the earthquake. And on the right side, those white patches there, that's bare soil that's exposed by the landslide. Normally that would either be white or, it would be either green with vegetation or a light golden brown with the dead vegetation. But here, bare soil has been exposed. So we've made complete change to this landscape in the matter of just a few seconds of shaking. Now, understanding the scope of this problem involves all 4 disciplines of the next generation science standards. Within the earth sciences, when we're usually thinking about landslides, we often talk about the forces that are involved. We talk about the driving forces of gravity, the resisting forces of friction that are holding a landslide block down a slope. And it really is very similar to a block on a plane like you might do in a physics class. Obviously, this includes concepts of earth science, and we're really thinking about how Earth's surface was reshaped by interactions between different Earth systems. There's a very important life science component to this as you're thinking about this event that happened and asking, gosh, how is the ecosystem going to respond? We've basically stripped off all the living things and topsoil from a huge area. And what's the succession going to look like in that ecosystem in the coming years? And then lastly, obviously when we have a lot of landslides, there might be hazard associated that to people, and engineering is about mitigating those hazards, and we can think about different ways that we can reduce the hazard. Maybe it's going to involve life sciences. We think about planting plants and having their roots hold things in place better, and how is that going to affect the forces? And so you can start seeing how we draw upon all of these disciplines as we try and understand this one event that happened in just a few seconds.